Thank you, Wanda. It's so lovely to be in front of a large room of people. I'm going to be saying that for a while after all of this Zooming and meeting virtually over the last couple of years. This is such a delight to be in a room full of people and to be with you all. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for the warm welcome and the lovely introductions. And my sincere thanks to IPU for their invitation to speak to you today, and in particular Wanda, but also Elia, Yule and Louisa. And in absentia, Leon Brenner, who is in some airport somewhere between here and the United States and on his way home. And I know he's very sorry that he couldn't be here. All is not lost, as I wrote to him earlier. He is in fact coming to Dublin in a few weeks' time as a guest of the Freud Lacan Institute, where he's going to be talking about autism and the voice. So I will get to see him in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, I get to spend the next while with you and talk to you a little bit about debating the queer alliance of psychoanalysis, sexuality and gender identity. Okay? So I think my talk is going to take about 55 minutes or so. I'm not going to go quickly, and hopefully there'll be a good amount of time afterwards for Q&A and discussion and to hear, importantly, from you. And so nice to hear that for those of you that might be a little bit shy about putting your hand up, that you can text in your questions and your comments that way. So first, I should tell you that I've organized this talk into 4 sections. The first section is dedicated to Freud's contribution. A second is to post-Freudian developments. The third to the contributions of Lacan. And a fourth is about the value of interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinary engagement in the area of sexuality. So broadly speaking, I've divided it up into those 4 sections. First, let's discuss Freud. His 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905, has always appealed to me. I think in part it has to do with how Freud begins the essays. Right on page 1 of the first essay, The Sexual Aberrations, he makes it clear that he's been evaluating the sexological literature and pays tribute to the work and influence of noted sexologists such as von Krafft-Ebing, Magnus Hirschfeld, Havelock Ellis, and others. He then, this is page 1, audaciously declares that what he has to say will directly oppose popularly accepted ideas about sexuality, and tells us what those popular ideas are. The idea that sexuality emerges, properly speaking, in adulthood, and that it is premised on an essentialist notion of attraction between the 2 sexes. That's not exactly how he says it, I've paraphrased it, but those are the 2 popular ideas, page 1, that he challenges immediately. Thus we could say that 2 things from the very beginning of psychoanalysis, 2 things, is that from the very beginning, psychoanalysis stands in opposition to popular opinion and ideological and cultural imperatives about sexuality. And its approach is interdisciplinary, located as Freud's was. And while it acknowledges heteronormativity as a dominating socio-cultural force, it does not for one moment take that to be the whole story about sexuality. Far from it. For, as the 3 essays scandalously demonstrated, human sexuality is extraordinarily diverse, exists from infancy, and never stops being troublesome for people. It never stops being troublesome because sexuality, as Freud says in those essays, no predetermined aim or object except satisfaction. And as a result, human sexualities and sexual actions sometimes go against cultural ideals and social imperatives, which are designed not for satisfaction, at least not directly, but to meet other aims, social, economic and cultural ends. I'm going to quote from the first essay. Symptoms, Freud wrote, are the sexual activity of the patient, end quote, which means there is an aspect of a sexual thought, wish, or satisfaction in every symptom. These thoughts and wishes become symptoms because they're unacceptable and are refused. And this process of refusal, or rather repression, produces the symptom. It's not the thought that produces the symptom, it's its unacceptability. The treatment of sexual issues, psychoanalytically, does not involve more sex or the famous or the infamous satisfactory orgasm, as in that offered by Wilhelm Reich's organ box, but a treatment via speech, a talk therapy. It would take Lacan to discern more clearly, with the benefits of structural linguistics, that it is not a thought or a wish that is exactly at the heart of a symptom, but rather a signifier, or even more precisely, a phoneme that carries the charge of desire or drive, the unacceptable aspect of desire or drive within it. I don't want to leave behind the three essays just yet, because its subversiveness merits a few further moments of consideration. Focusing on the first essay, which Freud begins, as we just said, by critiquing popular conceptions of sexuality generally, he then critiques popular conceptions of homosexuality, or rather homosexualities, these conceptions being that homosexuality is degenerate and innate. Here, he highlights homosexuality as a spectrum of homosexualities that includes a contingent form and dismisses the assertion of its degenerative or pathological nature. Freud, as such, undermined the essentialist notion of its supposedly innate character and debunked the indiscriminate attribution of a kind of lesser selfhood to homosexuality. In fact, sexuality itself is posed by Freud here as a vast spectrum that is best described in terms of drive, which is polymorphous, partial, and, as already stated, without any predetermined aim or object. It's hard to think of anything less normative than indicating that human sexuality has no predetermined aim or object. This drive, this trieb, to use Freud's carefully chosen word for it, and I'm very aware that I'm speaking to a German-speaking audience. Freud's carefully chosen word for it done so in order to distinguish it very importantly from the notion of instinct. And it is mistranslated in all of the English translations as instinct. A huge difference between the two. It emerges in infancy, this is the drive, and is pleasure-seeking. It is a drive to pleasure, and it's modified by various socializing and structuring forces that organize it into acceptable and recognizable adult forms. Freud was adamant that the heterosexual adult who emerges from the drive-ridden, polymorphous perversity of childhood is as much of a mystery from the standpoint of psychoanalysis as the adult whose sexuality is oriented to the same sex. Some 10 years after the three essays, in a famous essay, Drives and Their Vicissitudes, 1915, Freud went on to affirm the drive as the very backbone of psychoanalysis, assigning it 4 qualities: aim, object, pressure, and source, and giving it a meta-psychological status, thereby reasserting again the non-essentialist nature of sexuality, of human sexuality. There is no human sexuality except the pleasure-seeking, polymorphously perverse drives, which, insofar as as what they're constrained into. That is sexuality, what they're constrained into. And that, by the way, is what Juliet Mitchell has to say about it in her famous book in the 1980s about Freud and feminism. Yet, as we know, the popular conceptions radically challenged by Freud, 118 years ago, I'm doing the mathematics, remain with us today. For example, the idea of a natural or instinctual sexuality, and ideas such as that transitioning from one sex to the other supposedly goes against some innate propensity. Freud was nonetheless imperfect and ambivalent, and for all of his open-mindedness and progressivism, he did occasionally allow norms to enter in. And we can find, for example, the 3 essays culminating with a strange affirmation of heterosexuality. I'm going to quote, this is from the very end of the 3rd essay, which is the transformations of puberty. He writes there, and I'm quoting now directly, one of the tasks implicit in object choice is that it should find its way to the opposite sex. This, as we know, and this is important, is not accomplished without a certain amount of fumbling. End quote. It's not clear whether Freud is affirming the cultural imperative of heteronormativity or stating a position. But rather than become mired in annoyance, I prefer to see this as a warning shot across the bow of how difficult it is for anyone, as Freud himself shows us, to let go of normative presuppositions and their inevitable hierarchization of people into categories and classifications. So I'm going to move on now to post-World War II, post-Freudian psychoanalysis, and say a little bit about that. Post-World War II psychoanalysis did not embrace Freud's open-mindedness, and the post-Freudian period is generally characterized by a reversal of his approach. Some argue a return to pre-Freudian thinking about sexuality and about human subjectivity. And effectively, there is a valorization of conformity. It seemed that Freud's ideas, especially those about sexuality, were even more scandalous in the 1950s and 60s than at the beginning of the century. And the transplanted European, mostly Jewish émigrés, sought to fit into new European and Anglophone societies with a kind of sanitized version of psychoanalysis. In the United States, psychoanalysis no longer retained its lay status, which Freud argued so vociferously for. One had to become a doctor in order to practice psychoanalysis. He was adamant in his paper on psychoanalysis. This could not and should not happen. And there, in the United States, psychoanalysis sought to attune itself with the conformist concerns of the social body. We can reflect on this as the externalization of psychoanalysis's own efforts to render itself acceptable in the post-war era as the world sought to return to some kind of normality and to fit in with what Michel Foucault describes in his History of Sexuality as the deployment of sexuality. In this regard, to take Foucault's thinking a little further, it is the production of sexuality through the formation of special knowledges to which post-war neo-Freudian psychoanalysis contributed, supported by, to take Foucault's own model, a return to 4 privileged objects of knowledge dating back to the 19th century. The hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the Malthusian couple, and the perverse adult. The homosexual was just the figure who embodied the hysterical, but more likely the perverse child adult who threatened the reproductivity of the Malthusian couple and family, which, as the most active site of sexuality, was largely ignored in this respect. The high point of the psychoanalytic project of insisting on a teleology of heterosexual development was Charles Socarides and his North group in the 1970s and 80s in the US, which treated homosexuality exclusively as pathology. The only possible outcome, you could say, for the reconstitution of Freud's theory in stark developmental and essentialist terms. So there was, if anything, a return to pre-Freudian ideas about the natural and the instinctive, and the subversive aspect of the Freudian drive formulation was eliminated or left aside as an embarrassing mythical proposition of Freud's that could not be supported in a world of scientific empiricism. This was, of course, precisely Freud's point. The drive, which he defined, if you want to even call this a definition, as the demand made on the mind for work. That is the definition of the drive. The demand made on the mind for work for each subject, and as what spans the frontier of the mental and the physical, that's the other way in which he's defined it, could no more than the unconscious be rendered visible under a microscope or proven by universalities. Rather, the whole point of the drive, as incomplete and unsatisfactory as it is in Freud's writing, was to undermine the notion of a sexuality that took a developmental path and could be mapped according to expected or normative lines. Located within the primary process, the drive is not accessible to consciousness and is discernible only by its defenses, or as Freud called them, the drive's vicissitudes. As a field of psychically inspired impulses, the drive's source, as Freud indicates in the essay Drives and Their Vicissitudes, while somatic, as in coming from the endogenous side of things, the drive's source is represented by the drive itself and known only by its aim, and that aim is satisfaction. We're very far from empirical and essentialist thinking here. Here the important term that Freud uses is the term representation, and also the term demand. The demand made on the mind for work. It indicates the drive's basis is not in the soma, but in symbolization. The tendency to perversion, he called the drive in infancy and childhood polymorphously perverse. He's saying it's the drive takes satisfaction in everything, in nearly everything, just as infants and children take satisfaction in being touched, in being seen, and being looked at, almost every part of the body, and so on. That is polymorphous perversion. The drive in infancy takes satisfaction wherever it can get it, and certain aspects of that stick, retaining a traumatic and repetitive core. This is characteristic of everyone, but was unacceptable to post-war psychoanalysis as it sought to find its feet in a world that was rebuilding and, shall we say, busying itself reproducing, baby booming. Ego-psychologist, for example, who became very senior in the IPA, Rudolf Lowenstein, reframed the drive as the instinctual drive and patterned on ego functions that have nothing whatsoever to do with the primary process and inaccessible to ego is always primarily associated with the field of consciousness. And Heinz Hartmann wrote similarly of what he describes as the drive's, quote, continuity with biology, end quote, and indeed as autonomous agents of development. This reframing of sexuality and the subsuming of the polymorphously perverse drives within a teleology of normative and developmental lines had consequences for patient work and a history of othering non-normative analysans throughout the second half of the 20th century squarely took effect. This indubitably led to the decline of the appeal of psychoanalysis to those in sexual minorities, and a fraught relationship set in, arguably one that traces of which are still there. And that is something we took up in the book in part, and I'll get to that in a bit. The book I did with Noreen Giffney, the collection on clinical encounters in sexuality, psychoanalytic practice and queer theory, and in bringing the clinical discourse of psychoanalysis and the academic discourse and activist discourse of queer theory together. Those tensions emerged. Some of those historically based tensions continue to have an effect. I was drawn to Lacan because he heavily criticised psychoanalysis for these trends, and in advocating what he called a return to Freud, aimed to return psychoanalysis to the openness of Freud's early expositions and make psychoanalysis a more contemporary and contributory discipline. That work is ongoing, and I'd like to turn now and explore some of Lacan's contributions to understanding sexuality, which I argue offer a mode of approach to contemporary sexuality in its many permutations. Lacan and sexuality. The first thing to note is the relative absence of the term gender in Lacan's work, and an emphasis on the process of sexual differentiation, which he refers to as sexuation. He distinguishes a special object that causes desire, an impossible lost object. In French, the objet petit a. I'm going to use the English version of that, the O object. I'm going to use the O object in reference to the objet petit a. And he poses subjectivity as accessible only in the place where identity is not. I will develop this. The premature emergence of sexuality in humans, remember Freud's infantile sexuality, and its original non-coincidence with biology, splits sexuality off from reality and assigns it to the domain of the imaginary, which is characterized by identity relations and fantasy. Finally, Lacan places desire at the heart of the speaking subject, asserting that it functions as the fundamental phenomenon of human existence. It arises out of the necessity of human subjects to establish themselves in a world of language that is articulated by those whose desire brought them into the world. And the subject's alienation in language, or submission to the signifier, is caused as such by the other's desire. And for those of you who may not be versed at all in Lacanian psychoanalysis, Lacan distinguishes three registers: the imaginary register, which is the register principally of the image; the symbolic register, which is the register of symbolization, speech and language; and the domain of the real, which is that which is outside of representation, but is as important a force as the others. And I'm going to be referring to each of the three registers as we go on now. I'd like to suggest that one of the queerest of psychoanalytic concepts is the positing of the existence of unconscious desire, as it offers a strong anti-normative psychoanalytic conceptual tool. Lacan's subjective desire, founded by the O object, this impossible lost object, which this O object is an expressly Lacanian formulation, moves beyond Freud's notion of object choice and leaves gender out of it. The O object expresses the radical lack constituted at the level of the body, a causal gap that is anterior to the advent of the symbolic chain of language. It therefore falls outside of the field of representation and is literally what falls outside of the mirror image during the first assumption by the child of its identity I in the mirror. The O object emerges from several sources. It appears as the effect of an action on the body, from a cut that refers to bodily borders, topologically where inside and outside, where inside meets outside, from a fall of an object that is primal, that simultaneously produces subject and object. So we can trace this all the way from the lamella to the anal object, the oral object, the object gaze, the oral object, and so on. Notice these are also places where inside meets outside, where there are borders and cuts in the body as well. Thus it is figured as dynamic, with diverse forms, and the principal ones identified by Lacan are the gaze, the voice, the phallus, and the phoneme. This sexless, genderless, partial, drive-ridden object is a nucleus or kernel of the real that founds the gap in which desire is constituted. Thus it is that we come into being as desiring beings in the gap of what we call lack. It is precisely in an orientation to this lack, to this imperfection, that psychoanalysis is directed. Lacan's notion of the O object, thus, in being the cause and not the aim of desire, conceptually precedes gender and sexual activity. In consequence, the psychoanalytic concept of desire, in its multivalent relation to the O object and the three orders, the real, imaginary, and symbolic, significantly broadens the field of sexuality far beyond sex, gender, sexual orientation, identification, pleasure, genitality, perversion, and Oedipality. I find it helpful to go back again to Freud's idea. Symptoms constitute the sexual activity of the patient. If there isn't any phrase that opens up how broad the field of sexuality is, I think it's very well captured in that phrase, and I think we can make a connection here. The well-known sexuality studies writer, already referred to by Wanda, Tim Dean, puts it well. What desire, he says, what it expresses is, and I'm going to quote here, is desire's disquieting disregard for gender and for persons. In other words, desire has no essential object. Subversive nature of this concept ought not to be underestimated. And in divorcing sex from gender, Lacan can be said to foreshadow decades later the radical move in queer theory to think sexuality outside of the terms of gender. Sexuality therefore gains symbolization in the image and the word, but more fundamentally forms the traumatic core of the unconscious, that in turn forms the contingent foundation of the subject insofar as the subject is founded upon the lost object, the object cause of desire. In addition, Lacan made same-sex desire independent of perversion by conceiving of perversion in terms of desire rather than in terms of its phenomenological manifestations or symptomatic attributes. By defining perversion in terms of structure rather than sexual behavior, he overturned the regressive approaches of the neo-Freudians and adopted an approach closer to Freud's. For Lacan, homosexuality is not naturally perverse. It is a question of its infringement upon the normative requirements of the Oedipus complex, which are whatever they are for an individual subject. The categories of heterosexuality and homosexuality are equally a misapprehension on the part of the ego, of the dynamic unconscious that eludes all signification and recognition. Whereas the identifications we take on are necessary and emerge as a solution to the enigmas and traumatic nature of childhood, they're profoundly narcissistic and disloyal to the unconscious. Ultimately, there is no single identity that can definitively tell us what it is to be a man, a woman, gay, straight, or transgender. Let's turn now to sexuation. For Lacan, there are stakes involved in the assumption of sexual identity that produced impasses. The main impasse, he asserts, is that there is no stable basis for harmonious relations between men and women. In his oft-quoted axiomatic principle, and you no doubt many of you will have heard of this, the sexual relationship does not exist. He argues, obviously people have sexual relations, that's not what he's saying. That would be ridiculous. What he's arguing is that the oneness and harmony promised by sexual union is inherently impossible. This failure is guaranteed by the acquisition of language and the asymmetry of the initial primary relationship. The initial primary relationship is not with another person, but with the O object, the object cause of desire. He argues that at the level of the psychical economy, it is not possible for the sexes to attain a harmony, a oneness, qua the myth of Aristophanes, and culture serves as a vital prop to cover over this unpalatable truth. Lacanian psychoanalysis is one field that offers not only a deconstruction of this myth, and Freud refers to it in the 3 essays, but the possibility of operating beyond its stranglehold, such that new social links can be forged and the coordinates of the symbolic other can be expanded. The function of psychoanalysis, therefore, is to avow this principle, that the sexual relationship does not exist, and in so doing, to wedge open the constitutive realm of desire beyond the levels of confinement circumscribed by the field of culture and individual fantasy that unquestioningly privileges heterodoxy and homogeneity. And Lacan's distinction between desire and jouissance is also helpful. Jouissance is a complex term. I'm not going to do it justice here. It's relatively untranslatable from French, and it refers to an enjoyment that is too much. It is suffused with suffocating over-proximity. It evokes a question in relation to usufruct, that is the right to enjoy something. It's a pleasure that goes beyond pleasure to the point of intense suffering. The enjoying substance, and this is Lacan's, how he describes it in one of his seminars, the enjoying substance that is jouissance is without doubt a property of the living body, a body that enjoys itself, but that has a fundamental relationship with the big other. The big other is language, it's family, it's culture, and so on. Jouissance is perhaps Lacan's queerest idea of all. It calls into question the materiality of sexual practices by explicitly questioning what kind of pleasure is obtained. To conclude this section, let's observe a number of key points. Psychoanalytically, desire's origins are multiple and heterogeneous, independent of gender, and are structured by fantasy. Desire, thus, is not binary or heterosexual, it is heteros. It is a deeply intimate exteriority that is irreducible to full inscription. Our desire is other, which means it's rooted in language and in the symbolic and in its limitations. We are never quite tamed by language, and something essential always escapes. We can call this escapee queerness, non-binaryism, jouissance, excess, desire, the ineffable, das andere, the non-human, or the delusion becoming, or indeterminateness. Its empty place is the vital substance that drives us into life and away from entropy. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to queer theory and sexuality studies, trans studies, and psychoanalysis. Time-wise, okay? Okay. I'd like to suggest that it is in relation to the twin fundamentals, desire and subjectivity, that psychoanalysis and contemporary sexuality studies share a common purpose. For the speaking subject is founded upon and motivated by desire, which is originally independent of gender, and it offers the basis for a radically non-normative and non-heterosexist account of sexuality and desire. But let's take queer theory. As a school of thought, Queer theory emerged in the early 1990s from a dissatisfaction with the efforts of sexuality studies to deconstruct the discursive, social, political, and historical conditions of marginalised sexualities, in particular homosexuality, from within the categories of identity and oppositional politics. One of its axiomatic principles is its resistance to definition. Anna Marie Oguzzi, important person in the field in the early days, defines queer as a part of queer's theory's semantic clout, part of its political efficacy depends on its resistance to definition. Queer, therefore, you could say, is an identity without an essence, and is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. Queer then demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. As David Halperin put it, quote, queer describes a horizon of possibility whose precise extent and heterogeneous scope cannot in principle be delimited in advance, end quote. Queer theory strategy is that of exploiting incoherencies that destabilise normativity, with a particular focus, I suppose, on heteronormativity, and all manner of categorisations, including man, woman, black, white, and so on. It has a suspicion of identity insofar as it engenders a critique of particular forms of knowledge and the ways of being that they sanction in cultural and historically specific ways. Queer has a defiant stance in relation to the rigidity with which identity categories continue to be enforced, and the belief that such categories are immovable. This follows closely Foucault's claim, and I quote, "The existence of power relationships depends on a multiplicity of points of resistance. These play the role of adversary, target, support, or handle in power relations. These points of resistance are present everywhere in the power network. Hence, there is no single locus of great refusal or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there is a plurality of resistance." End quote. For Foucault, marginalised sexual identities are not simply victims of regulatory power regimes, they are produced by those same mechanisms. In support of this, he cites the rise of the homosexual as a category relating to structures of power and resistance, and as an instance of discourse operating entirely within the mechanisms of power, though not entirely in their service. This is also from the history of sexuality. Thus, in its critical response to humanism, queer theory follows no universally applicable strategy, only localised practices, the effects of which cannot be entirely predicted in advance. Therefore, it's possible to say that psychoanalysis and queer theory share a common purpose in their critical stances to universalising explanations of the subject and the world, in their radical explorations of the function of identity, and in their commitment to the idea that there is no universal truth. Queer theory has drawn from psychoanalytic theory and applied it brilliantly in cultural analyses, in critiques of human relations, othering, critiques of othering, the construction of difference, politics, art, and the lived experience of inequalities. Queer theory's discomfort with definition indicates not just a reworking of discursive strategy within the broad field of sexuality, cultural, and critical studies, in order to decenter the Cartesian subject and counter homogenizing tendencies, but is also a tacit recognition of the limitations and fallacies of the symbolic realm, which is the field of representation and symbolization. To this, psychoanalysis adds the dimension of the real to the field of sexuality, indicating that there is an aspect of it that is irreducible to full representation and image, thus plaguing it to be an oxymoronic plug in the gap that incites coupling or rapport. Insights, but not solves. In the 8-year research project that I undertook with Noreen Giffney between 2009 and 2017, which culminated in the edited collection Clinical Encounters in Sexuality, Psychoanalytic Practice and Queer Theory, we endeavoured to put queer theory in conversation with clinical psychoanalysis to evaluate a number of key questions, including the discourses on sexuality that underpin psychoanalytic practice, how sexuality impacts upon transference consciously and unconsciously, and exploring why sexuality is prone to reification. What transpired with this queer marriage between psychoanalysis and queer theory were fascinating points of critical overlap and a fecundity of broader significations that inspire, provoke, disquiet, and complicate contemporary thinking about sexuality. And the book is done through a series of staged encounters. A first encounter was staged between a queer theorist who explores the themes of identity, desire, pleasure, perversion, ethics, and discourse. And this first encounter was 14 psychoanalytic practitioners who each responded to the queer theory essays without any instruction or outline as to how to do it. So they could do it as they wish. So 14 psychoanalytic practitioners from across, I think it's 6 psychoanalytic traditions responded. It was a majority were in Lacanian, but also importantly from other traditions. And this was followed by another encounter in which 7 specialists in both sexuality studies and psychoanalysis, such as Tim Dean and Jacqueline Rose and some others, responded to the encounters between the psychoanalysts and the queer theorists. What emanates from the book is an uneasy relationship between queer theory and psychoanalysis, which is important, revelatory, and open to analysis. The sometimes uneasy encounters in the book, which bring to the fore discord and friction as well as amity and congruity, can be framed as a series of problematics concerning the horizons of dichotomization relative to both fields. Specifically, how each field has approached what Patricia Elliott describes as 2 disabling dichotomies. The 2 disabling dichotomies between the biological and the social, and between the normal and the pathological. How each field has approached these 2, as Eliot calls it, disabling dichotomizations. The question of disabling or entrenching dichotomization refers to the reductionism of attributing difference in binaries, of essentializing biological cause or oppressive social construction, and in terms of the normal or the pathological. For psychoanalysis, these binarizing dichotomizations fail to capture what it means to be human, because psychic life involves unconscious dynamics that are not reducible to either the biological or the social, but involve elements of both. Moreover, the normal pathological binary is sacrilegious to psychoanalysts, given the Freudian attribution that conflict, polymorphous perversion, fantasy, and suffering are constitutive of human subjectivity. I'm associating here to the contemporary phenomenon of the person who comes in for analysis today, who's almost to a person arriving in now with some kind of diagnosis or other that they've extracted from the internet, that they've pathologized themselves already before even beginning the first step of their talk therapy. It's completely in contra to what is being said here. Now, deviations by psychoanalysis from refusing these disabling dichotomizations underpins some of the complications and unease in the relationship between queer theory and psychoanalysis. That psychoanalysis became a co-conspirator and reflected society's persecution of homosexuality throughout the middle and late decades of the 20th century demonstrates that psychoanalytic attitudes and theories and practice are not immune from the cultures in which they are formulated. And that's Jack Drescher who has said that, if you're interested. This invokes the necessity for psychoanalytic clinicians to continue to engage with and challenge the wide field of normalization that characterizes the socio-cultural fabric and which psychoanalysis is inescapably a part of. On the part of queer theory, the theorization of social constructs in oppressive and immutable terms and the elision of the role of the unconscious and the body in human experience has reinforced, arguably, rather than loosened, dichotomization. And as Lisa Downing has noted, the tendency to circumscribe queer can circumscribe queer can inevitably fall into an identity trap of its own and end up reifying queer. At its core, queer theory interrogates what makes human relations queer beyond identificatory matrices and are loaded with socio-cultural power dynamics, and it investigates what brokers those very power dynamics. From Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, which brilliantly exposed the role of sexuality as a literary trope in sustaining heterosexual normativity, to later expositions such as Lee Edelman's poking of cultural logic in the eye with his embrace of the death drive and Saint homosexuality, and Lauren Berlant's skivering of the optimism of the political and social order rooted in notions of equality, mobility, security, and intimacy, which she convincingly poses is largely unattainable in contemporary capitalist liberal societies. And we must instead find ways of putting atemporality, aesthetics, and fantasy to use in times of precarity and even ordinariness. Queer theory offers as such an epistemological and practical framework for untangling what supports unthinking thought and action. This offers perhaps some food for thought in our time of heightened foci on identities and gender identity in particular. While there is always an element of self-authorization in every identity, insofar as the ego aims at coherence and once activated takes on the function of I, identification is not something internal or innate, even if it seems that way. It comes from outside and has roots deep in the prehistory of the infantile and childhood periods. It comes from outside and it's internalized. That's what I'm referring to. There is no stable sexual identity in the unconscious. Our vulnerability rests on the fact that we can only rely on the alienating, fragile positions regulated by the symbolic order. Identity promises a seeming alignment between body and mind, in which gender self-identity can be made not only self-evident, but to match anatomy, supported by a phantasmatic rapport between body and mind, between the human and the natural. The torturous, traumatic, uncertain process of taking up a position as a man or as a woman is for psychoanalysis decidedly unnatural for all human subjects, regardless of how normal they may appear, with normality to be absolutely distinguished from natural. Psychoanalysis has its foundation, the ceaseless questioning of all aspects of human sexuality for each and every subject, whether that person manifestly conforms to norms or transgresses them. In this way, the gift of psychoanalysis is to destabilize the categories of the normal and the pathological, while creating and sustaining an opening for wonder. So, let's build some concluding points here. Queer theorists, nonetheless, continue to quarrel with psychoanalysis and suspect it of being in tow with cultural logic that is structured in terms of binary oppositions. It may be because psychoanalysis refers to binary pairings, to sexual difference, to repression, lack, and the unrealizable, that queer theorists think it supports compulsory norms such as heterosexuality. Psychoanalysis disquiets in subscribing to the idea that the process by which desire and jouissance are tamed and delimited to sexual jouissance is subjectivity. Subjectivity, thus, by virtue of being empty, enlivens and permits potentialities, some of which do become inscribed through forms and norms. But this decentered subject is never equal to an identity. An identity never fully captures who we are. This, psychoanalysts and queer theories can probably agree on. Let's take a moment to consider identity. It typically implies membership in a group, as well as supplying a feeling of unity through identification with a body image, that while alienating, allows us to imagine or anticipate subjective completeness. We actively identify with elements of others by considering them as mirrors of ourselves. However, in psychoanalytic terms, the domain of identity, while important for the organization of the self, it's very important that we form a sense of I. It is, however, fated to alienation, narcissistic investment, aggressivity, jealousy, feelings of inferiority, and egoic efforts at competition and domination. Perfect, we could say, for the hyper-competitive, individualistic discourse of the markets, so dominant nowadays. The belief in an authentic, quote, an authentic gender self, which continues to be popular, within and without sexuality and trans studies, is founded upon ahistoricism and faith in the transcendent. Paradoxically, it is a discourse which leaves little room for change. While portending to be progressive, it endorses the belief that what is has always been and will always be. One can hear in this discourse an aim at the perfect alignment of knowledge, body, and identity, which would offer proof of the sexual rapport, of the sexual relationship. The notion that man and woman, that two subjects can be perfectly cohered and complementary, which also implies a world in which unity, totality, and completeness are possible. Lacan, who asserted, again, that the sexual relationship does not exist, that this rapport is not possible between two subjects, because the primary relationship is between the subject and the object. So you've got two subjects in their primary relation with their object relating to each other. So you can begin to see how this complementarity is not possible. Lacan, who asserted that sexual relation does not exist, is referring to an entire universe of impossibilities, including the fact that we are not transparent to ourselves and that words do not correspond to things. Moreover, one of the difficulties arising for psychoanalytic work today is the silencing of questioning and the unpopularity of taking time in working with gender variance and cross-sex identification. This has several dimensions to it. First, there is, as I've already been through in some detail, the history of post-Freudian ego psychology and psychiatry in which reprobate practices supported a heteronormative approach to sexuality and the pathologization of homosexuality and transgenderism, endowing psychoanalysis with this shadowy and not fully acknowledged history. Recent issues in this area have highlighted by the trans advocate Paul Preciado show there remains some way to go. On the other hand, does this not have to do with investments in identity on another level? Let's consider the analyst's approach to identity and implications for the transference relation. The analyst endorses any points of identity attributed by the analysand to themselves and to the analyst, but does not offer content or an image to that, but incarnates, embodies the O object, the driver maker, and the empty place of desire, which is unique and can only be approached and named by the analysand. To do this, the analyst does not restrict the analysand's identity to its content, but extends it to what the analysand's representations cannot grasp, which is the remainder, the driver remainder, that disturbs the experience of identity. Analytic work in this sense goes beyond cognitive representations to the points where identity fails in its mirroring and produces its alienating effect. What is crucial to this is the analyst's own lack, a point of symbolic castration and not knowing that facilitates the subject being able to take some distance from coinciding with their self, which is an interiorized image of the other, and make room for the signifiers that actually represent them, but invariably exceed their grasp. To accept being an analyst means not knowing, not agreeing with or affirming anything in particular, especially in the area of identity and sexuality. This is not popular today. The analyst is supposed to affirm the subject, especially if there's a question of transitioning or cross-sex identification. By contrast to the domain of imaginary identification, an ethic of difference oriented by an acknowledged and irreducible foreignness within is one that seeks not regimes of coexistence but living with difference. Sex is never fully captured and mediated by words and images. Something always escapes. And psychoanalysis and sexuality studies and queer and trans studies share common cause in addressing the otherness and non-humanness of humanity. And not, for example, binding it up in ideas of wholeness or worse, wholesomeness. The inherent failure of sex to establish a rapport or final meaning doesn't stop it from being represented as a total success in culture, social relations, and the arts, while its failure at a socio-cultural level is phantasmatically projected into an outside or other. Contemporary social, political, and institutional groups, including psychoanalytic ones, rise and fall, are sustained and dissolved, depending on how accommodating they are to the question of difference as being inside and not outside the group. Intolerance is actually intolerance of one's own excess drive jouissance that is mislocated in others. It is, as Toni Morrison puts it in The Origin of Others, quote, the foreignness within, which is perhaps the commonest feature of all humanity. One of the aims of psychoanalysis is to first discern and then question what to do with this excess that resists symbolization, this hated, irreducible, expurgated, and incommensurate otherness, which is both intimate and exterior at once. I'm nearly finished. For psychoanalysis, this must include integrating a difficult and painful history of normative practice. I would also argue that the spirit of interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, so vital in Freud and others, such as Lacan, Jung, Ferenczi, Bion, Phillips, Leader, and, if he was here, Leon Brenner, wedges open areas of contradiction and difference that is important. Sexuality studies continues to draw from psychoanalysis, and that is very, very important. That in spite of the history, that psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic concepts and formulations continue to be of interest in trans studies, sexuality studies, queer studies. But such a spirit of interdisciplinarity is not always as present as it could be. This may have something to do with worries of interdisciplinary contagion, and the idea that a discipline is diluted by its allegiance with another. It may also have to do with some anxiety, and I'm directing this at psychoanalysis, within psychoanalysis, in distinguishing between clinical psychoanalysis and applied psychoanalysis, and the importance of maintaining them as separate and distinguishable. This is important, but we should not forget that the application of psychoanalytic theory in considering culture, groups, politics, and big questions of philosophy, medicine, religion, art, literature, and history were undertaken and established by Freud himself. To conclude, what do we do with our own intolerable excess? Do we domesticate it? Do we assign it to others? Do we liberate it? What will be curative will be an ability to tolerate contradiction and otherness. Disciplines that query and challenge the hatred of otherness in the different and changing ways the big other designates it. De-essentialize notions of identity and self, support the dismantling of normative economies of desire, and arguably what will also be curative will be providing the space for a kind of listening that allows for the presence of the as yet unknown and unthought. Thank you.